Hi there, kia ora. My name's Cathi from Software Solutions, and you're looking at one of a collection of videos that support my Microsoft Excel Level 3 data manipulation course. What I'm doing in this video is introducing you to pivot tables. Now, the file that accompanies your course notes and your courseware is called Excel 3. I've saved it as Excel 3-2. And if you've been following these videos, then I'm actually in the target sheet and I'm in the All Records Report view of this sheet, basically in a clean copy of targets. So what we have here is we have a list. Every column has a column heading, and if I press Control down arrow, I can see there's 271 rows of data, so 270 records and one row of the column headings, and then Control up again. All right, now this list is so long and can even be longer that really to print this out and give this to people, it doesn't tell them anything. So data by definition isn't information. Data is just raw data, and what we're going to do is create reports that give us information and insights about what's going on with this data. Now, pivot tables and pivot charts are a perfect way of summarizing and giving you insights as to what's going on with this data, and that's why it's a very popular management tool. Now, to create a pivot table, we need to first of all be sitting in this list, and then if we go to the Insert tab in the ribbon, we have on the far left-hand side a pivot table button. So I'm going to get you to click that. It immediately starts wiggling around the range that you're sitting in, and I'm just going to go with that, and it's going to create a pivot table in a new worksheet. So I'm just going to go OK and accept the defaults. What then appears is a pivot table report. It doesn't look like much at this stage, but it is actually a pivot table report by definition. And what you have on the right hand side is what we call a field list. Now the field list, you can press the X and make it go away. And what you'll notice up here in your ribbon is pivot table analyze, and there's a field list button. The field list button will bring it up and send it away also. So if you're missing your field list, ensure the field list button is clicked. You may not see your field list though if you do click away from your pivot table report. At the moment I'm sitting within this boundary here, but if I clicked over here, I lose my field list, but I also lose my pivot table analyze tab in the ribbon. So I can't hit the field list button. I need to be back in context. So you've got to click back on pivot table over here in order to see the pivot table analyze tab, the design tab, and the field list on the right hand side. So that just tells you the things that you need to see, and if you're sitting in the pivot table, you will see those. Now the field list again, mine may be appearing different to yours. The field list actually has this little gear sort of button called Tools. And if you click this button, you're probably seeing the field section and the area section stacked like this. Often the field list is really long, and so I find this layout doesn't work for me. So you have the ability to hit this little tools button and choose a layout that does. And so I'm actually going to ask it to show me the field section and the area section side by side. And that's my preference. So I'll choose the second one, and that way I can have a huge list of fields here and I can have the sections out to the right hand side, side by side. The other thing I like to do is sort this field list. So if I go back to this button, we can actually sort the field list from A to Z. If you've got a lot of fields in your field list, having them in the order of the source data isn't always helpful. So I can sort them from A to Z, so actual's at the top and year is at the bottom. So I think when you're creating a pivot table, first thing is take a moment to get this the way you want it and the field list sorted the way you want it. So that's what I'm going to do with this. Now the field lists are actually, if I go back to targets, the column headings from the targets list. And so what we now do in this new sheet is we decide what columns do we want and what sections or buckets. I'm going to ask that we put department as a row. And so there are departments alphabetically, a unique instance of each department alphabetically listed as rows. But because we've only got a few departments, they actually would be more helpful as columns. So I'm going to now drag department and drop it into columns. So a pivot table is really grabbing fields and putting them into these various buckets or sections until you're happy. So I've got these departments now showing as columns. I'm going to grab the region and show them as rows because I actually have more regions than I do departments, and so that goes as rows. And then what I want to do is I want to grab the actual sales and make these values. So where the row and the column intersect, that's where it's going to sum the actual values. So we've got our departments as columns, our regions as rows, and where the two come together, it sums the actual values. And that's our pivot table. I'm going to rename this sheet just by double clicking sheet 1, pivot 1. Oops. Okay, I could change column labels to department. I could actually type that. And I could change row label to actual regions. And I could change sum of actual to total sales, just to make it a little bit easier on the eye. Okay, let's make another pivot table, because typically you have more than one pivot table coming off the one list. So I'm going to go back to targets, make sure I'm sitting in the list, go back to insert, back to pivot table, and just go OK. Now this time I'd like to drag region as a row, actual as a value, drag actual as a second value, actual as a third value, actual as a fourth value, and actual as a fifth value. So you can actually add a field to the value section more than once. Why do I want to do this? The reason I want to do this, I want to show the total sales, the number of sales, the average sales, the percentage of sales, and I want to rank the region by sales. So I need to see more than one instance of sales. So I could just change my row labels here to regions. All right. Let's start with sum of actual, the very first one. If you click it, you'll get the option to go into value field settings. And if you go into there, that's where it says the source is the field actual. Awesome. The function being used is sum. But the sum of actual is an awful title or custom name. So I'm going to change the name to total sales. I also want to format the numbers in this pivot table independently of the source data. So I go into number format and I say, give me accounting and 0 decimal places. When I go OK and OK, the first column has now got the custom name total sales and it's showing as accounting with 0 decimal places. Now, let's deal with the second one. Sum of actual 2. If you click it, go into value field settings, what I want to do is change the function. I'm going to change the function to count. This then affects the name. So then I'm going to change the name to number, because that's the number of sales. And don't need to change the number format, so I'm just going to go OK. And that is the number of sales. So clearly, Rotorua, Taupua and Tauranga had the most number of sales. Let's look at sum of actual 3. Give that a click. Value field settings. This one I want to average. And I'm just going to give it the name, average. And I'll go into number format and choose accounting and 0 decimal places. OK and OK. So that is the average sales. So even though Taupua, Tauranga and Te Puke made the most number of sales, actually no, Rotorua, Taupua and Tauranga made the most number of sales, Auckland actually and Kawerau actually made on average the largest sales. Okay. Now, sum of actual 4, click on that option, value field settings. I think we can clearly say now that we understand custom name, we understand function, and we understand number format. Where we now need to go and venture is into show values as. By default, show values as is no calculation. I want to change that to percentage of the column total. Notice there's a number of percentages. Percentage of the row total, percentage of the column total, percentage of the grand total, and even percentage of, and then choosing a base value. But I'm going to choose percentage of column total, and I would like to show the name, just the percent symbol. If I then go OK, what we see is the name is percent symbol, and we can see who had the highest percentage of sales. So Taupua at 16.06 had the biggest contribution to the total sales. So now I'd like to rank them. So sum of actual 5, I go into its value field settings, show values as, and then I'm going to change it to rank. There's all sorts like running total, rank largest to smallest based on region. And I'll call it ranking. And when I go OK, there is the ranking. Let me just control wheel into that. So there's the ranking from largest to smallest based on region. So if I was to click, say, on total sales and sort that using data in the ribbon and Z to A, I can see ranking number 1 is Topor, contributing 16.06% to the total, an average of 1544, but the number of sales is what pulled them right up to a total of 64,860 in sales. So that's another pivot table that is telling you a lot. Instead of printing out this, which doesn't tell you much at all, we create a variety of pivot tables that's summarizing what's going on. And I'm going to name this sheet 2 pivot 2. Now, when you create a pivot table, especially one like that that's got quite a bit involved in it, you may want to just duplicate it and tweak it if you want to create another pivot table that's very similar. I'm going to say to you, I need a third pivot table that pretty much is this, but instead of by region, it's by department. So I'm going to make a duplicate of pivot 2 by holding the control key and dragging pivot 2 to the right, which makes pivot 2 2. I'll double click it, hit the right arrow, backspace the last 5 characters and put a 3 on the end. This is pivot 3. Now pivot 3, I want to get rid of region, so I pull that out of rows and see how this X appears? I just drop it. It's not the only way, but that's the way I probably enjoy, just dragging it out and dropping it. And then I'm going to drag department and drop it into rows because I need that information by department. If I click on total sales and I sort it from Z to A, I can clearly see mechanical had the largest number of sales. But the ranking's gone a little bit skew-if, and so we need to update the ranking because it was based on region. Let's go to ranking, let's go to its value field settings, show values as, and instead of basing the ranking on region, base the ranking on department, and OK. So some things might need tweaking, but it still saved us a lot of time by just duplicating the sheet instead of recreating the wheel. So think about that too. Often when I have to make a number of pivot tables for a client, I make the most complicated one first. And then I duplicate that because every other one is going to be a simpler version of the most complicated one. Just a suggestion. Okay, let's have a look. I want to create another pivot table, a fourth pivot table. Let's go to targets. Let's just click in the list somewhere. Let's go to insert and let's choose pivot table. So we're creating it from scratch and OK. This time I'd like to see department as a row, region as a row, nothing as columns, actual as a value, and year as a filter. Okay, so because we've got 2 or more fields in the rows bucket or section, you end up with little minuses. Let me just zoom in on that. You end up with little minuses where you can collapse and expand the department, engineering, marketing, so on and so forth. So you can have more than one in the rows. When you add something to filters, this appears above the pivot table and allows you to filter the year 2020 or the year 2022. So you can have things, so I could even put department as a filter as well. Then I can filter the year and the department, or put department back into rows, maybe under region. So now my focus is on region and what departments are in it. So get comfortable dragging things between the various sections or buckets until you land on something that's useful. I might actually make year a column, for example, and so now I'm seeing the sales by year and by region and by department. Now the pluses and minuses, coming back to those, sometimes it's tedious to click on Auckland and collapse it, click on Christchurch and collapse it. You just want to collapse all of them. So you can right click one of these regions and you have the expand and collapse, and you can collapse the entire field. Also appears up here in the ribbon. But if I collapse entire field, then all of them are collapsed. And if I right click or go up to here, I can expand the entire field. Expand and collapse, expand entire field. So you can collapse and expand if you've got more than one field in your rows. Let's now change this to, well, I don't want anything, so I'm just going to put a space. That's the easiest way to get around that. Space for there and a space for there. You can just do that. Or you could type years here. That might be nicer. And then I'll just take it down a bit. Okay. And I'm going to name this pivot table Pivot 4. Now, something else that you can do is, let's look at the Pivot Table Analyze tab. When you sit on a pivot table and you go to Pivot Table Analyze, we need to understand a couple of these buttons, like refresh. If the source data changes, that is the data that's sitting in your source list here, these pivot tables will not automatically update. We need to tell the pivot table to refresh. And so if the data changed in targets, I would refresh the pivot table, which updates it. If I wanted to refresh all 4 of them, then I would hit the drop down on the refresh button and I would say refresh all. And that would update all the pivot tables. So be mindful of that. If your data is out of date, you need to refresh your pivot table. There is an options button on the left-hand side here you can click. And there is a data section here where you can say refresh the data whenever you open the file. So that might be helpful. Refresh the data whenever opening the file. So let's do that and okay. And okay. And it'll take effect once you close and open the file. But if you change the data while you're in the file, you're going to have to refresh it manually. Now, another thing to understand is where a pivot table is getting its data from. Sometimes when someone sends me their Excel file and they go, my pivot tables aren't working, I've never seen it before. And so I look at a pivot table and I'm like, where are you getting your data from? That's this button, change data source. When you go change data source, you may not have any intentions of changing it. You just want to know where the data is. So you go change data source and it immediately takes you to where it's getting its data from. And it says it's getting it from the sheet called targets in the range A1 to H271. Now the problem with this is when you dump the data or get the next lot of data or when the data is updated, the data can exceed row 271 and may not be picked up. That new range may not be picked up by the pivot table. So one of the recommendations I make and do when I create pivot tables is I don't select a range, I actually select the entire columns, A to H. That way, if the data grows or shrinks in length, it'll always be encapsulated by the pivot table because it'll always grab everything from A to H and I'll go okay. That may cause a blank option to appear, but you can easily filter out anything you don't want to see, which includes the blanks. And so I just filter out the blanks. It's a small price to pay to make sure that the entire data source is being collected. So that's the change data source and that's the refresh. All right. The other thing that's important is let's have a look at maybe slices. I might go to this one here, for example. Oh no, let's use this one. If I'm sitting in a pivot table and I go to the pivot table analyze and I choose insert slicer, you can choose how many slices you want. So I might have a slicer for region, one for department, one for year, and okay, 3 slices. You can move them by grabbing their title and just pop that over there, pop department over here, and pop year maybe over here. You can move them, you can also resize them just by grabbing one of the little placeholders around the outside. You can also color them. I might make this one purple, make this one a darker blue or aqua, and make this one a darker blue. So you can color them. You might also decide that you don't want them to print. Often when I put them on a pivot on a sheet, I don't want them to print. So I right click and I go into size and position and properties, just like we did with the macro buttons. Size and properties, and I go into properties and I say don't print it. And this one here, don't print that one either. And this one here, don't print it either. And in fact, don't move them either. Don't move them when you resize and change the cells. Don't move and don't move. Don't move, don't print. So if I went Control P, you would see that they wouldn't print. Only the data would print. And I'll go back out. So what does a slicer do? Well, a slicer is literally an easy way to filter a pivot table. So if I'm only interested in Auckland or Christchurch or Hamilton. And I can clearly see Hamilton doesn't have a marketing, mechanical or production department either. And if I'm only interested in 2022, then that's what it'll show me. And I'm only interested in automotive. So you can narrow down what you're seeing. And then each slicer has its own clear, clear, and clear button. If you want to see a range of regions, you can drag from Auckland to Hamilton and from 21 to 22. And then clear and clear. If you don't want to range, but you want to see Rotorua versus Te Puke versus Tokoroa, hold the control key. And automotive versus mechanical, and 2020 versus 2022. Then hold the control key and choose the ones that you're after. So it's a user-friendly, nice, easy way to slice and dice what it is that you're viewing in your pivot table. And so people can then just print, Control P, what they want. And those slices don't print. And I'll go back. And I'll clear that slicer and clear that slicer and clear that slicer. So slices are a very good addition to your pivot table, and they're on the pivot table analyze. You just got to be sitting in a pivot table, go for pivot table analyze and insert slices, and you can easily insert slices. But you can also insert timelines. Let's create maybe another pivot table, or let's just use something that we've got here. Let's use this one. If I insert a timeline, there's really only one date column in our data, so I'm going to choose deadline and OK. And here's my timeline here. Again, you can stretch them and you can easily color them as well, whatever color you prefer. Here I'm seeing months, so if I want to see, for example, June, July, August, those are the figures for June, July and August, or June, July, August, September. And so that affects the ranking. Or June, I can't hold the control key. It's only for a range. So I can choose October, I can look at June, I can look at October, and I can look at December. I can change months to years, and I can compare 2021 with 2022, or select the entire range, or just choose a particular year. So you've got years, quarters, months, and days. And then just clear the filter also with this drop down here. So if I click on the pivot table and look at pivot table analyze, we've looked at insert slices and insert timelines. And these filter connections just tell you what slices are affecting what. So deadline is affecting pivot 3, but department, region, and year, those 3 slices are affecting pivot 4. So pivot 4 has got those filter connections. Yeah. And deadline is not affecting pivot 4. That's what that button does. The next thing I would say is let's create another pivot table and look at grouping. I'm going to go back to target, so I'm going to go to insert pivot table. This time I'm going to base it on the entire columns A to H because I think that's best practice, and OK. I'm going to ask for sales, so I'll add that to values. And now I'm going to grab deadline. Oh, actually, no, let's take that out. Let's put target in values and let's add deadline as a row. Now, as soon as you add a date to a row, Excel wants to group it. It wants to group it into years, into quarters, and that's what appears in your pivot table. Here's years, quarters, and then the deadline. And you can see the ability to collapse and expand. Let me just zoom in on that. Ability to collapse and expand. So that's 2022 broken into quarters, which is then broken into months. You may not want it to do that. And also you can filter out any of these ones here, for example. You might want it not to do that. So I'm going to actually right click a year and choose ungroup. And that gives me back just the deadline. I didn't want it to group. So if you don't want it to group, right click something and ungroup it. And so now I've got the deadline appearing as dates. Or if you do want to group it, right click it, choose group, and tell it how you want it to group. I want to group it into years and months. I don't want quarters because our quarters don't correlate with calendar quarters. And so, okay. And so what I've got now is I've actually got the years and the months. I could probably right click and group again, by days. So now I've got the year, the month, and the day that those sales were made. So you can cause your own grouping. Right click and ungroup. If it's something other than a date, let's take date out. Let's put target into rows. And let's put region as a column. And let's just leave that for that. Actually, let's take region out for the moment. Let's say I want to group these numbers. I want to group them into 500s. So I right click, I go into group, and I say starting at 1,000, ending at 3,000, can we group these into 500s? And okay. And so you have 1,000 to 1,499, 1,500. So you can group numbers as well. Like you might, yeah. So if you've got a lot of rows, group them by date or group them by number. Or, let me get rid of target. You can actually group them by text as well. Let me put region into rows. Let's say I want North Island versus the South Island, which doesn't leave me an awful lot. So I'm going to just get rid of the blanks. Auckland, hold the control, Christchurch, Hamilton, Kawerau, Rotorua, Taupo. That's pretty much everybody except Christchurch. Leave Christchurch out. Right click and group, and that group is called group 1, so I would call that North Island. Christchurch is the only one in the South Island, but I would right click, group that. Yeah, you can't group 1. So Christchurch is just on its own. If you had a second one like Dunedin, then you could have chosen those two with the control key and then group that as, but I would just probably just collect Christchurch. Group that as the South Island. So you can group dates by years, quarters, months, etc. You can group numbers into bands of 100, 200, 500, what have you. You can group text just by holding the control key and choosing more than one and then calling it North Island, South Island, what have you, and so on and so forth. I can right click North Island and I can also ungroup it. So grouping is a thing that you can do. What else? Let's have a look. This is pivot 5. Let's have a look at pivot charts. I've got these regions, and let's just say I bring up actual values. All right, so these are the actual sales by region. To turn that into a pivot chart, we simply hit the pivot chart button. It brings up the option to choose what type of chart. So I could go for, say, a pie chart and maybe a 3D pie chart, and okay. And so there's the pivot chart that goes with my pivot table. I can then go to the Design tab to the right of Pivot Chart Analyze, and I can choose things like a quick layout. So I can just roll over them and have a look at what they look like and decide which is the best. I might just go for layout number 1. Let me just stretch that because I can. I might then change the colors to a different palette, whether it's monochromatic or one of the colorful palettes. So I might just choose this one. Mind you, that's hard to see. I might choose that one. Yeah. Then I can choose a different style. So as I roll over the styles, I can see what they look like. So I might choose this one. I might zoom out, hold the control key and zoom out a bit because I'm up at 175%, which is, I might just take it back to 100% magnification, which looks better, and just stretch it out a little bit. You also have the ability, Topol was our largest seller, so I could click on this slice, for example. Now I can see there's circles around all the slices. I just want to click on this one slice, so I hone in on this one slice and I slightly pull it out. Because that was, maybe a little bit less, that was our biggest seller. And if I drag that down and drag that in, you can clearly see what's going on there. I might decide also just seeing the percentage is not sufficient, so I'm going to go for my green plus. These are the sorts of elements you can turn on, like I could turn on a legend, but I don't think it needs it. They're encapsulated in the data labels. But percentages can be misleading, so I'm going to go to data labels, more options, and besides seeing the category name, which is the month, and the percentage, I want to see the value as well. So when I choose the value as well, I can actually see what the value is and how that affects the percentage. And again, I'm just trying to find that balance in sizing. You can click on the chart because it is actually a frame inside of a frame, and just stretch that out a little bit so you're fully utilizing that frame. That's better. And yeah, and work with that. That's looking better. So that's my pivot chart, and the pivot chart affects, the pivot table affects the pivot chart. So if I was to filter out, say, certain regions, I don't want all of them, I just want Auckland, Hamilton, Christchurch. And if I go OK, that's all I'm seeing in my pivot chart. And then if I clear that, select all, clear the filter, I'm back to everything, and I can just remove the blank. And OK. So that's your pivot chart. Now the other thing is your pivot table and affecting the look of it, the design of it. I might take this one as an example, pivot 4, I think it'll sell it the best. Once you've got your pivot table, and we've looked at most of the options on pivot table analyze that you would use, you've then got to the right of pivot table analyze a design tab. And if you've got the space, I might move the slicer over a little bit. If you've got the space, you might change the layout of your report from being a compact layout, which is the default, to either outline or tabular. This is a report layout here. So report layout, if you go for outline, if you've got that space, it spaces it out a little bit, which I think is easier to see. Or you might go for tabular, which lays it out a little bit. And I like tabular because it puts the totals at the bottom. If I go back to, say, outline, the totals are back at the top again. But if I like outline and I want the totals at the bottom, you can go for grand totals, subtotals, and tell them to show at the bottom of the group rather than at the top of the group. So subtotals can be at the bottom of the group. Here they are here, Auckland's total, as opposed to subtotals being at the top of the group, or actually not showing subtotals at all. So you can control the subtotals. I will show them at the bottom of the group. Grand totals, whether you want to see your grand total as rows and your grand totals as columns, and or you can control that using the grand totals option. I'm going to put it back to tabular because I think that's the clearest layout. I often like to have a blank row between each group. It just segments it a little bit. So blank rows after each item creates a nice segregation. And you may also want to reconsider the style that you've chosen. As you roll over the various styles, you can see what they look like. Now, 1 in 10 men, when I last Googled it, are colorblind. And so for that reason, I tend to stay in the blues, the grays, the purples, and the aquas. And I try to stay away from traffic light colors like red, green, and orange, because they will not necessarily see the information the way that you would like them to see it. So I'm going to go for an aqua that is easier to see. So I might go for that option. Choose a style, decide on blank rows, a layout, grand total, subtotals. Design is really quick to sort of get sorted. And often what I find is I keep leaning to the same designs all the time because they're the ones I like. And then just get it all looking nice. That is all our pivot tables done. Now, anything else left I need to tell you about pivot tables? Filtering, we understand. I think that's about it. You can move a pivot table if you want to. You can move a pivot table and put it on the same sheet as another pivot table. Just be careful that you don't put them one under each other if they have a tendency to grow, because you'll start getting errors when they can't overlap. Try to put them side by side. I tend to put my pivot tables into separate sheets. Yeah. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope I've given you ideas and tips and tricks regarding pivot tables. They are really good, pivot tables and pivot charts. Please like or subscribe so I know whether I'm appealing to people or not. I hope you've enjoyed it. Take care. Ka kite. My name is Cathi Barker. This is Software Solutions. Bye-bye.